Good morning everyone, and I'm really sorry not to be with you for this important meeting, but I hope this remote presentation will provide a little bit of interest for the debate. Now, what I'm going to focus on is reconstruction within World Heritage Sites and the role of ICOMOS in that process over the last 10 years or so. First, to start with the World Heritage Convention. The one overriding obligation for state parties who've ratified the convention and who have properties inscribed on the World Heritage List is to sustain their outstanding universal value. And they must do this, including sustaining authenticity and integrity, in response to whatever happens to them, whether as a result of traumas, war, natural disasters, or whatever. And what I would like to highlight is the way that ICOMOS's advice on reconstruction and the committee decisions are reflecting this obligation to sustain outstanding universal value, rather than necessarily standard doctrines. And then I would like to suggest that the tools available do need to be updated to reflect this reality. Now, the operational guidelines for the implementation of the World Heritage Convention are in fact not guidelines at all. Rather, they're protocols that must be followed. This is a key document for the implementation of the convention. And currently, what it states about reconstruction is very simple. It says that in relation to authenticity, reconstruction is justifiable only in exceptional circumstances. And again, it's only acceptable on the basis of complete and detailed documentation and not on conjecture. This is very limiting, and as you can see, only related to authenticity. There is no mention of integrity or of outstanding universal value. Now, ICOMOS, as an advisory body to the World Heritage Committee, is asked to advise on whether proposals for reconstruction are acceptable. And it is faced with an inherent dilemma between, on the one hand, this obligation to sustain outstanding universal value, and secondly, the obligation to adhere to the operational guidelines. Outstanding universal value is not only related to built structures, it's much broader than that and can be about associations between places and society. It's all about what society as a whole values, and it may reflect traditional practices, uses, associations with historical events, coherence of plan, as well as architectural expertise or archaeological completeness. Just to mention very briefly the charters that are also the context, in a way, for the reconstruction debate. The Venice Charter of 1964 is very clear. Article 15 sets out that there should be no reconstruction, only anastylosis. That's reassembling existing parts. That's all that may be permitted. The Borough Charter, or the latest version of 2013, is much more nuanced, which is interesting. And it talks about reconstruction being appropriate, or may be appropriate, as part of a use or practice that retains cultural significance of the place. In other words, reconstruction may provide a use that can thus enable cultural value to be sustained. And in the World Heritage context, use and practice are actually often part of outstanding universal value. What I'd like to do is now offer a few examples of the decisions taken by the World Heritage Committee over the past few years in response to ICOMOS's advice that illustrate these dilemmas that I've just outlined between the obligations to sustain OUV and the obligations to adhere to the operational guidelines. But just to alert you to the fact that the word reconstruction has been mentioned at World Heritage Committees in 274 State of Conservation reports for 88 different cultural properties. So it's the idea of reconstruction, and the discussion on it is very widespread. And this presentation is just going to offer you a few very select cases which I've arranged under the headings that you see there. Reconstruction before inscription is also quite common. This is BAM and its cultural landscape. BAM was very badly damaged by an earthquake in 2003 when over 20,000 people lost their lives, and a large part of the town was destroyed, and the citadel that you see here as well. Now, BAM was inscribed on the World Heritage List in June the following year as an emergency inscription. And what was inscribed was not just the citadel, which was what had been on the tentative list, but the much wider cultural landscape of the town, the date palms irrigated by underground canats, all of the things that supported the citadel and explained how the citadel and its context and surroundings worked as a whole. And this approach was also seen as a way of involving local communities who had suffered so much, and to support the idea of sustainable development. What is interesting, I think, here is that the top right photograph shows the citadel before the earthquake. And what happened was that all the 20th century restoration more or less dropped off the citadel, showing really how inappropriate the materials and techniques had been, but it was also quite beneficial because that work had been to some extent quite speculative. But the property remained on the danger list for about 9 years while much of the work of reconstruction was carried out, and in fact many more projects remain to be done. Turning to the Mongolian, the Orkhon Valley cultural landscape, this valley was the center of Genghis Khan's empire. And within the grazed plains are the archaeological remains of his city and of his huge monastery, which you can see here, Erdenizu. And above, on a hilltop, is this small monastery on the left that grew around natural caves used by hermits. Both of these monasteries suffered destruction in Soviet times in the 1930s when there was a program of deliberate annihilation of religious buildings. Parts of this small monastery were rebuilt in the 1990s from photographic evidence and using traditional methods. This was the earliest possible moment when the community could rebuild what they saw as a significant and sacred place. And it was ICOMOS' view that this rebuilding was a reaffirmation of the religious value of these places and a way of bringing them back to life and linking them to the past. Because the outstanding universal value of this property is all about the way empires came and empires went, but the pastoral people and the religious values of the communities were sustained over time. Now, these two examples, Warsaw in Poland and Mostar in Bosnia and Herzegovina, I'm sure are very well known to you. And they're similar in reflecting almost spontaneous cultural responses to disasters. In the case of Warsaw, the Warsaw uprising in 1944 saw almost 90% of the city centre destroyed by Nazi troops. But immediately after the war, a 5-year reconstruction campaign by its citizens restored much of the old town, churches, palaces, marketplaces, and so on. They had the skill and the memory of what had been there before the destruction. And at the time of the inscription in 1980, the OUV was seen to be related not just to what had been there before, but to the reconstruction process. And authenticity was all about the process of reconstruction rather than the precise materials and form. Now, originally, the Mostar Bridge was built by the architect Sinan in the mid-16th century at the height of the power of the Ottoman Empire. Hostilities that broke out in the 1990s during the Bosnian War saw the systematic destruction of much of Mostar Old Town, including the bridge and the warehouses and buildings around it. The old bridge was almost immediately rebuilt under the auspices of UNESCO and the World Bank and completed after 4 years' work. Now, at the time of inscription, ICOMOS acknowledged that the reconstructed bridge had at best a kind of truthfulness, even though in material terms a considerable portion of what was there was not identical to the original pieces. And ICOMOS stressed that this reconstruction of the fabric must be seen as being in the background compared with the restoration of the intangible dimensions of the property, which are what was seen to underpin its outstanding universal value. It was inscribed only under criterion 6 as an exceptional and universal symbol of coexistence of communities from diverse cultural and religious backgrounds in the face of overwhelming catastrophe. Timbuktu in Mali was where in 2012 Islamic militants destroyed 16 mausoleums of Sufi saints and damaged some of the 3 main mosques. Since then, all the mausolea have been reconstructed. And for understandable reasons, this work was done extremely quickly to cover the graves and somehow reinstate their sacred spaces. But the process has also highlighted the difficulty in determining just how the World Heritage Committee should interact with such circumstances. In this instance, there's been no discussion at the committee or with ICOMOS on how the work's been undertaken, nor has the rationale for the work been set out or its precise documentation. Nonetheless, all of us acknowledge that these 6 monuments are a key part of the outstanding universal value of Timbuktu as a sacred site, and that this work must be seen as part of a community process to reclaim what is their own. There is a similar urgency being faced in Sana'a in the Yemen, but there completely different conditions prevail. The houses have been bombed and people want back their homes. Our colleagues in the UNESCO regional office are saying surely there can be shortcuts in the restoration process to allow work to proceed quickly. Sana'a was inscribed on the World Heritage List for the extraordinary coherence of its vibrant urban form, with the buildings built from rammed earth, some 6,000 houses, many dating back to the 11th century. ICOMOS is concerned in dealing with this restoration, not just for the way the new houses are constructed, but for the impact on their neighbours which hold each other up. Our approach is being framed by respect both for the value of the living city and for the value of the architectural traditions, both of which underpin outstanding universal value, as well as by concerns for the safety of buildings and people, all of which mean that it's really difficult to have a quick response, as many people are asking for. Bagrati Cathedral and Gelati Monastery I will now turn to, and in particular Bagrati Cathedral. This was constructed in the 12th century during the golden age of medieval Georgia, but it was blown up by Turkish invaders in the 17th century and subsequently left as a ruin. In the 20th century, some consolidation work was undertaken of the masonry remains, and that's on the left is how it looked at the time of inscription, when it was inscribed as an outstanding monument of Christian medieval architecture, which reflected a very specific style that developed in Georgia. In 2010, the State Party announced that the President had agreed to rebuild the cathedral, and work commenced almost immediately. But the work was carried out in mass concrete with concrete beams and a concrete dome. Not something that the committee wished to see. The committee asked for the work to be halted, but this did not happen. And when an ICOMOS mission visited the site, it was found that the work had been carried out without any attempt to reuse most of the fallen stone blocks on the site. And in ICOMOS's view, the intervention that had taken place had so completely overwhelmed the original fabric as to destroy any idea of the quality of the original form. What we now have, which you can see the bottom right, is a sort of pastiche of the original. And as a result, the committee requested a major boundary modification to remove Bagrati from the property and just to leave the Gelati monastery on its own. And that is now a process that's still ongoing. But I would like to stress that ICOMOS was not against bringing the building back into use, but given its architectural value, we considered that the work should respect the original materials and form. The tombs of the Buganda kings in Uganda is an example of a structure destroyed by fire. The fire in 2010 destroyed the Mazibu Ozala Mapanga building, which was the largest building within the ensemble of tombs, housing the remains of 4 Bugandan rulers. ICOMOS almost immediately supported the rebuilding of this tomb, as we considered that it exemplified the living and thriving traditional practices that are what underpin the outstanding universal value of this property. The property is all about traditional building practices, the constant renewal of these buildings, as well as the ritual practices associated with them. Longevity is all about the longevity of processes rather than of actual structures. And the committee agreed that the reconstruction of this building could be justified, provided that there was authenticity in design, materials and techniques, as well as use. And this approach was seen to revive and reinvigorate the traditional craftspeople in Rwanda, who did not at that time have a very high prestige. 16 years on, I'm sad to say that we still don't have a restored building. And once this work is complete, we must somehow undertake a study as to quite why it's taken so long to achieve what seemed like a simple process. My conclusions are quite simple. Sustaining outstanding universal value is and must be the overriding obligation of the Convention. But given the multifaceted aspects of outstanding universal value, simple rules on reconstruction are not feasible. The practices of the committee are leading to a new understanding of what reconstruction means or should mean. We need to articulate these within the operational guidelines and perhaps through ICOMOS guidance to set out what is happening and perhaps define a new way forward. Thank you.